am Captain Olivia Harrison of the United States Air Force. My entire life, I have followed one order: service before self. But I never imagined that my greatest enemy wouldn't be found on a battlefield across the ocean, but sitting right in a marble-floored living room in Beacon Hill, my own biological mother. On March 15th, 2024, at the Grand Fairmont Copley Plaza Hotel, in front of 127 of Boston's most elite guests, my mother, Victoria, slapped me. A stinging blow that sent my pearl earrings skittering across the floor, all because I refused to transfer my $2 million penthouse as a wedding gift for my lazy younger sister. She hissed in my face, "You ungrateful little grunt. You think that cheap uniform gives you the right to talk back to me?" The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for me to collapse or strike back. But they didn't know that in my suit pocket wasn't a tear-soaked handkerchief, but evidence of an $875,000 fraud that would send this entire fake, prestigious family to prison as soon as the party ended. If you've ever been considered the black sheep of your family just because you chose independence over submission, please hit like, subscribe, and listen closely. This is how I launched my final counter-offensive. The smell of JP8 jet fuel and hydraulic fluid has a way of clinging to your skin that no amount of industrial soap can ever truly erase. For me, that scent represents home more than any house ever has. I was at Hanscom Air Force Base, my sleeves rolled up and my hands covered in a thick black layer of grease as I worked through the maintenance checklist on a piece of ground equipment. My world is one of cold steel, precise measurements, and the comforting weight of a wrench in my palm. In the military, everything has a place, and every action has a purpose. But that afternoon, the rhythmic clanking of the hanger was interrupted by the sharp, persistent vibration of my phone on the metal workbench. It was my grandmother, Eleanor. Eleanor was the only person in the Harrison lineage who understood that honor wasn't something you inherited in a trust fund, but something you forged through service. Her voice over the line was thin, but carried a warmth that always made me feel like I was 10 years old again, sitting in her sun-drenched garden. She didn't waste time with small talk. She told me she had finalized her will. She said that I was the only one who had truly been there for her, the only one who didn't view her as a walking bank account. While my mother, Victoria, was busy hosting charity galas for status, and my sister Madison was spending thousands on retail therapy, I was the one checking in on her between deployments. Because of that, she was leaving the Seaport penthouse to me. That penthouse was more than just $2 million of prime Boston real estate. To my family, it was a crown jewel, a stage for their social theater. To me, hearing Eleanor say it was mine felt like a heavy mission being dropped onto my shoulders. I knew the piece of my quiet, disciplined life was about to be shattered. I looked at my reflection in the polished chrome of the machine I was fixing, seeing a woman in a flight suit with grease on her forehead, and I realized I was about to walk into a different kind of combat zone. I wiped my hands on a rag, the weight of her words sinking in, and I felt the first stirrings of a storm that I knew would change everything. A month later, the April air in Boston was crisp and unforgiving as I pulled my battered Ford truck onto the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill. Driving that truck past the rows of gleaming Land Rovers and Porsches felt like a deliberate act of defiance, though to me, it was just the vehicle that got me from point A to point B. I parked in front of the Harrison family mansion, a towering structure of red brick and white trim that looked more like a museum than a home. Every time I stepped through those heavy oak doors, the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. It wasn't just the air conditioning. It was the practiced, hollow elegance of a family that valued appearance over affection. Walking into the grand living room felt like walking into a military tribunal, but without the fairness of the uniform code of military justice. My father, Richard, was perched in his leather armchair, hidden behind the pages of the Boston Globe as if the world outside was beneath his notice. My sister, Madison, was draped across the silk velvet sofa, her eyes glued to her phone, her thumb mindlessly scrolling through a feed of curated perfection. And then there was my mother, Victoria. She sat with her legs crossed perfectly, a glass of chilled Chardonnay in her hand, watching me approach with an expression that suggested she was evaluating a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the room's aesthetic. I was still in my civilian clothes, a simple pair of jeans and a flannel shirt, which made me feel like an ink blot on their pristine white rug. Victoria didn't offer a hug or even a warm greeting. Instead, she took a slow sip of her wine and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. She began to speak in that soft, melodic tone she used when she was about to say something devastating. She told me that Eleanor must have been confused when she wrote the will. She said that a girl like me, who spent her days in the mud and her nights in barracks, wouldn't know what to do with a place like the Seaport Penthouse. Her words were like velvet-wrapped daggers, aimed straight at the life I had built for myself. She looked at my calloused hands and my sun-weathered skin with a pity that felt more insulting than a slap. She argued that Madison needed the penthouse to establish herself in the city's social circles, to host the kind of people who actually mattered. According to her, I was a soldier, a person bred for hardship and anonymity, and therefore, I didn't need or deserve the luxury Eleanor had intended for me. She expected me to just nod, to agree that my life was worth less than Madison's social ambitions, and to sign the papers she'd already prepared on the mahogany coffee table. But they forgot one thing about the daughter they had spent years trying to ignore. They forgot that I don't take orders from people who haven't earned the right to lead. I stood there, my back straight, my feet shoulder-width apart in the stance I had assumed 1,000 times on the flight line. I looked my mother directly in the eye, refusing to flinch under her icy gaze. I told her that I wasn't suffering, and I wasn't just a soldier. I told her that I was proud of my service and that Eleanor's will wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I told them clearly that I would not be selling, moving, or transferring a single square inch of that property. The reaction was instantaneous. The mask of elegance slipped from my mother's face, replaced by a raw, ugly fury. She slammed her wineglass down on the table so hard that the stem nearly snapped, the red liquid splashing out like a fresh wound onto the white marble. She told me that if I chose my ego over my family, I was no longer a Harrison. She threatened that I would learn very quickly how cold the world could be without the family name to protect me. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I had spent my life following orders, but for the first time, I realized that my most important mission wasn't overseas. It was right here, protecting the only piece of real love I had ever been given. The summer of 2021 was one of the hottest on record in Massachusetts, but the atmosphere within the Harrison family had turned into a deep, biting permafrost. I started noticing the changes on social media first, which is a modern kind of torture when you are being systematically erased. Madison was posting a relentless stream of photos from Martha's Vineyard, clinking champagne flutes on the deck of a yacht, white linen garden parties, and that massive diamond engagement ring catching the sun in every shot. I wasn't in a single frame. I wasn't even invited to the engagement party. When I finally called my mother to ask why I was finding out about my only sister's milestone through an Instagram feed, her voice was as cold and sharp as a surgical blade. She told me with a straight face that she assumed I was on duty and didn't want to disturb the national hero with such trivial family matters. Then she added the sting. She said my serious military face would have just ruined the lighthearted celebratory mood for everyone else. It was then I realized that I wasn't just being left out. I was being intentionally deleted from the family narrative because I had dared to hold onto what was legally mine. But my mother, Victoria, didn't stop at simple exclusion. She began a sophisticated campaign of character assassination that was far more dangerous than just being ignored. I started hearing the echoes of her work from old family friends who still had a lingering sliver of a conscience. At the Winchester Country Club, over salads and iced teas, she would lean in and dab her eyes with a silk handkerchief, pretending to be the grieving, concerned parent. She whispered to the Boston elite that the Air Force had broken me. She told anyone who would listen that I had returned from my deployments aggressive, unstable, and suffering from a severe case of PTSD that made me paranoid and pathologically greedy. She painted a picture of me as a troubled soul who had practically coerced a confused elderly Eleanor into signing that penthouse over to me. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. People I had known since I was a child started looking at me with a mixture of pity and genuine fear when they saw me in town, as if I were a ticking time bomb ready to explode. I was being turned into the family scapegoat, the villain of the story she was writing to justify her own bitterness. The true weight of this isolation settled into my bones during Thanksgiving in 2022. For most Americans, it's the most important day of the year, a time of warmth and shared gratitude. For me, it was a deafening silence. I sat in my small rented apartment near Hanscom, the gray November light fading outside my window. I had a pre-cooked turkey breast from the local supermarket and a tablet propped up against a glass of water. I made the mistake of checking the family's public live stream. I saw the mahogany table in Beacon Hill groaning under the weight of fine china, heirloom silver, and more food than 20 people could eat. I saw my father, Richard, finally looking up from his paper to raise a glass to the perfect family while Madison laughed in the background. My phone stayed completely silent. No calls, no happy Thanksgiving texts, nothing. The loneliness was a physical presence in the room, heavy and suffocating. I eventually turned off the screen and opened a leftover MRE from the base. Chili with beans. I chewed it mechanically. The bland, processed taste, a stark reminder of the world I chose over the one that had rejected me. It was the price of my dignity and my grandmother's legacy, but in that moment, it felt like a price I couldn't afford to pay. By the end of 2023, however, the tide began to shift in a way my mother never saw coming. She had moved Grandma Eleanor into the Brookhaven nursing home without telling me, hoping to cut off my last line of support. I found out through a clerical notice and rushed there, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to find a frail, broken woman. Instead, when I walked into that room, Eleanor reached out and grabbed my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm. Her eyes weren't cloudy or confused. They were filled with a sharp, focused fire that Victoria could never hope to quench. She leaned in and told me that she had agreed to move there to stay safe, because back at the mansion, my mother was frantically tearing through her private files, looking for any legal loophole to break the will. Eleanor looked me in the eye and issued a command. Hold your position. She told me not to fight the rumors yet and to let them believe I was defeated and unstable. A soldier doesn't fire until the target is in sight, Olivia, she whispered. We formed a secret alliance that day. 2 generations of women who refused to be broken or manipulated by the people who were supposed to love us most. I left that nursing home no longer feeling like a victim, but like a commander preparing for a long-overdue counteroffensive. Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own family, watching from the outside while they celebrate as if you didn't even exist? It is a special kind of heart-wrenching pain that most people will never understand. If you have ever been treated as the scapegoat or the black sheep, just for standing your ground and keeping your integrity, please leave a comment with the word resilient below and hit the like button. I want to know that I am not the only one who has had to eat a lonely dinner while the world kept turning. Your support and your stories mean everything to me as I continue this journey of reclaiming my life. This strategic silence became my greatest weapon. While the Harrisons spent the next few months toasted to their own perceived victory and gossiping about my downfall, I was quietly gathering the evidence I needed. I let them believe I was drowning in my own instability, but in reality, I was just waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. The invitation that arrived in early 2024 wasn't just for a wedding, it was the opening I had been waiting for. The gold-plated envelope sat on my scarred wooden desk like a gilded summons from a world I no longer recognized. It was heavy, the kind of expensive cardstock that felt like a brick of pure arrogance in my hand. I opened it to find the formal announcement: Madison Harrison and Tyler Caldwell, Fairmont Copley Plaza, March 15, 2024. But it wasn't the calligraphy that caught my eye. It was the small handwritten note tucked inside in my mother's elegant looping script. It simply said, "Behave yourself for once. Don't disappoint me again." It wasn't an invitation to a family celebration. It was a military order to appear and surrender. I tossed the card onto the table, where it landed right next to the slide and barrel of my dismantled service pistol. The contrast was almost poetic. The cold, functional steel of my reality resting beside the hollow, shiny pretense of theirs. I stared at that invitation for a long time, feeling the familiar weight of being the family's resident problem, the one who had to be managed so the golden girl could have her perfect day. The silence of my apartment was broken a few days later by the sharp ring of my phone. I didn't even need to see the caller ID to know it was Victoria. Her voice came through the line, dripping with a sugary, artificial warmth that made the hair on my arms stand up. She started talking about the wedding, about the flowers, and how Tyler was on the fast track to becoming a partner at his prestigious law firm. Then, the velvet glove came off. She told me that she had been thinking about my situation. She pointed out that I was single, had no children, and lived a simple life supported by a steady military paycheck. In her mind, me holding onto a $2 million penthouse in the seaport was a waste of resources. She suggested, with a chilling lack of shame, that I should sign the property over to Madison and Tyler as a wedding gift. She framed it as my duty, a way to compensate for all the years I spent away from home, neglecting my family obligations while I was off playing soldier. When I didn't immediately agree, her tone shifted from manipulative to outright venomous. She didn't just want the apartment, she wanted to strip away the very core of who I was. She told me that I didn't have the class to live in a place like the Seaport District. She said the neighbors, the city's elite, would be uncomfortable seeing someone like me, with my rough hands and my grim military attitude, coming and going from such a prestigious building. She called my career low class, and suggested that I was better suited for the barracks and mess halls, where I could be around people of my own kind. She begged me not to be selfish, claiming that my stubbornness was actively sabotaging Madison's bright future. Every word was a calculated strike against my dignity, a blatant denial of my worth as anything other than a bank account for her favorite child. I sat there, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the phone, listening to my own mother tell me that I wasn't good enough for the world she lived in. I thought about the long nights in the hangar, the deployments, the discipline I had cultivated, and the genuine pride I felt for my uniform. To her, all of that was just a smudge on the family's reputation. The resentment, that deep, simmering sense of injustice, boiled in my chest, but I didn't let it explode. I remembered Grandma Eleanor's warning, wait for the right moment. I realized that my silence wasn't a sign of defeat. It was a tactical retreat before a massive counterstrike. Victoria was so blinded by her own elitism and her obsession with Madison that she couldn't see the storm I was about to unleash. I took a deep, steadying breath, the kind of breath you take just before you step out of a plane. My voice was calm and unnervingly cold when I finally responded. I told her that I would indeed be at the wedding. I promised her that I would bring a gift that Madison and Tyler would never, ever forget. I told her to make sure the stage was perfectly set for the event of the season. I could hear the hesitation in her breath, a momentary flicker of confusion at my sudden compliance, but she quickly dismissed it, satisfied that she had finally bullied me into submission. I hung up before she could utter another word of fake gratitude. The moment the line went dead, I walked over to my desk and opened the heavy manila folder that Grandma Eleanor had smuggled to me. It wasn't just papers, it was a roadmap of the fraud, the lies, and the systematic theft that the prestigious Harrisons had been committing for years. As I flipped through the evidence, the pain of my mother's insults began to transform into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just a soldier. I was an investigator, a witness, and the bringer of a long-overdue justice. I realized then that my life wasn't defined by their rejection. It was defined by my ability to stand up when they expected me to crawl. The battle lines were drawn, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly how this war was going to end. At Hanscom Air Force Base, the world wakes up with a mechanical roar that most people would find deafening. But to me, it is the sound of order. It was exactly 7 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in early March when I finished my 5-mile run. The air was biting, a typical New England chill that seemed to seep into my lungs, but the sweat on my back felt like a shield. My phone began to vibrate against the cold metal of a nearby bench. I expected a routine check-in from the hangar, but when I saw the caller ID, my heart skipped a beat. It was Grandma Eleanor. Her voice, which had spent the last few years sounding like brittle parchment, was suddenly as sharp and focused as a bayonet. She didn't lead with pleasantries or complaints about the nursing home food. Instead, she spoke with the authority of a commanding officer delivering a final mission briefing. She told me to get a pen and paper immediately, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. She gave me the name and private number of a man named Marcus Webb, a high-stakes litigation attorney who had been her silent guardian for months. She told me that if the situation at the upcoming wedding moved beyond my control, I was to call him and him alone. In that moment, I realized my grandmother was not a victim of her age or her circumstances. She was a master strategist conducting a war from a hospital bed. The information she shared next felt like a physical blow to my chest, a shock that eclipsed any physical pain I'd ever felt in training. Eleanor revealed the dark underbelly of the Harrison family finances, specifically a transaction involving our family's beloved vacation home in Cape Cod. For years, I believed it had been sold to cover Eleanor's rising medical costs, but the truth was far more sinister. Back in 2020, while Eleanor was lying in a coma at Massachusetts General Hospital, fighting for her life, my mother, Victoria, was busy liquidating her mother's legacy. An investigative reporter and old friend of mine, Daniel Reeves, had uncovered the paper trail. Victoria had sold the property for $875,000, but Eleanor had never seen a penny of it. Most sickening of all, a forensic expert had confirmed that the signature on the deed was 98.7% likely to be a forgery. My mother hadn't just been greedy, she had committed a calculated crime against her own flesh and blood while that blood was barely circulating. This was the ultimate betrayal, a case of elder financial abuse that made my skin crawl with a mixture of shame and white-hot fury. Eleanor's voice remained cold and steady, like ice water running through a vein. She explained that she had stayed quiet, enduring the isolation and the insults, just to gather enough evidence to ensure that when she finally struck, it would be a killing blow. She told me that the upcoming wedding at the Fairmont Copley Plaza was never meant to be a celebration of love for Madison. It was a carefully constructed trap designed to corner me, to use the pressure of public scrutiny and family duty to force my hand into signing over the Seaport Penthouse. But Eleanor had turned the tables. She told me that this event was our only chance to drag Victoria's secrets into the light of the Boston elite, the one group of people whose opinion she valued more than her own soul. Her orders were simple but absolute. Show up, stand my ground, and do not sign a single document. She promised me that reinforcements would be ready to mobilize and would arrive at the hotel within 60 minutes of my signal. I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my fingers tingle, the kind of clarity that only comes when you are staring down the barrel of a necessary conflict. When I hung up the phone, the world looked different. The sun was finally cresting over the hangar roofs, but the warmth felt artificial compared to the cold fire burning in my gut. I walked back to my apartment with a new kind of rhythm in my step, the deliberate pace of someone who was no longer just a target, but a hunter. I spent the evening preparing my combat gear for the gala. I pulled out a floor-length evening gown in a deep, midnight navy blue, the exact shade of the Air Force dress uniform. I ironed every fold and pleat with the same obsessive precision I used on my BDS, ensuring there wasn't a single stray thread or wrinkle. I spent an hour polishing my high heels until they shone like mirrors, mirroring the black leather of my jump boots. Inside my small, understated clutch bag, there was no room for lipstick or a compact mirror. Instead, I tucked away the business card of Marcus Webb and a miniature digital recorder, its battery fully charged and its memory cleared. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, seeing a woman who was no longer the bruised and battered black sheep of the Harrison family. I whispered a quote from General George Patton to my reflection. "Pressure makes diamonds." I was ready to walk into the lion's den, not as a victim seeking approval, but as a representative of the truth they had tried so hard to bury. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon on March 15, 2024, when I stepped through the revolving gold doors of the Fairmont Copley Plaza. The air inside was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive lilies and the underlying metallic tang of old money that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains. I stood tall, my back straight in the way only a decade of military service can forge. But I felt like a ghost, haunting a palace that had long ago forgotten my name and replaced it with a list of grievances. As I scanned the ballroom, counting 127 guests draped in silk and diamonds, a young man in a crisp tuxedo stepped into my path with a look of practiced authority. He held up a hand, blocking my way with a polite but firm smile, and told me that the staff entrance was located around the back of the building near the loading docks. He paused, squinting at my midnight navy gown, and then stammered a shallow apology, admitting he had mistaken me for the private security manager due to my rigid posture. It was a small, unintentional sting, but it confirmed the tactical reality I'd already suspected. In their eyes, I did not possess the soft, pampered aura of a debutante. I was simply a tool meant to provide order or service, a piece of functional equipment in a room full of decorative ornaments. Before I could find a quiet corner to observe the tactical layout of the room, Madison appeared, cutting through the crowd like a ship made of white lace and $15,000 worth of Vera Wang silk. She did not offer a hug or even a flicker of a sisterly smile. Instead, she held out a manicured hand as if she were waiting for me to hand over a dry cleaning receipt or a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of expensive gin and an overwhelming sense of entitlement, and demanded to know where the papers were located. She called me an idiot under her breath, asking if I had actually forgotten to bring the transfer documents for the $2 million penthouse because she had no time for my typical military delays. I looked at my younger sister, seeing only a stranger fueled by a hunger for social status that I would never understand or respect. I told her calmly that I had come to offer a blessing and fulfill my family duty, not to surrender my life's inheritance on her command. Her face, a mask of heavy contour and expensive foundation, twisted into a snarl of pure indignation that threatened to crack her porcelain appearance. She hissed that I was being incredibly selfish, arguing that I was used to living in squalor and military tents anyway. So keeping a luxury apartment was a waste of a prime social asset. She claimed I was going to humiliate her in front of her new in-laws because she had already promised her friends that the after-party would be held at my seaport home. The interaction left me feeling as though I were breathing through a gas mask, the atmosphere of the grand room becoming increasingly toxic with every passing minute. I spotted my father, Richard, standing near a mahogany bar with a glass of 19-year-old whiskey in his hand, looking perfectly at ease in his tuxedo. I walked toward him, a desperate and irrational hope flickering in my chest that he might finally act like the man I used to imagine he was when I was a child. I whispered his name as I reached his side, but he flinched, looking around the room as if he were afraid the local socialites would catch him talking to a family pariah. He did not look me in the eye when he told me that I had made my mother very angry with my recent stubbornness. He urged me to just behave and be reasonable for once, so I would not ruin Madison's big night and cause a public scene that he would have to explain. Then, without a single word of comfort or a hint of fatherly defense, he turned his back on me and vanished into the crowd of laughing men in velvet jackets. His cowardice was a far deeper wound than Victoria's overt and predictable cruelty. It was the ultimate abandonment, a silent confirmation that in this family, loyalty was a commodity that had been traded away long ago for the sake of a quiet and comfortable life. The final blow of the evening came from the periphery of the room, in the form of Patricia Holloway, my mother's closest confidant and a woman who lived for gossip. She approached me with a practiced and pitying smile that did not reach her eyes, which remained as cold and hard as blue marbles. She patted my arm with a condescending touch and told me she had heard so much about my difficult situation from Victoria over the past few months. She claimed it was so noble of me to hold the apartment for Madison until the wedding day. And she added that everyone in their circle understood why I was being so difficult. She leaned in and whispered that my mother had explained about the psychological effects of the war and how the trauma had made me a bit unstable and paranoid lately. She told me not to worry because they all knew how to handle people like me with the proper amount of patience. I gripped my glass of plain water until my knuckles were white, realizing that Victoria had spent the last 2 years weaving a web of lies that turned my honorable service into a mental sickness. I was not just a guest in their eyes. I was a tragic spectacle, a broken soldier who did not know how to exist in polite society anymore. I stood there, completely isolated in the middle of a crowded room, realizing that every step I took was through a minefield they had laid specifically for me. The clock struck 7:30 in the evening, and the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza underwent a sudden, theatrical transformation. The warm, ambient glow of the chandeliers dimmed until the room was swallowed by a heavy, expectant darkness, leaving only a single, piercing spotlight focused on the center of the stage. My mother, Victoria, stepped into that circle of light, clutching a silver microphone with practiced elegance. To the 127 guests watching, she looked like the epitome of a grieving yet proud matriarch, her voice trembling with a carefully rehearsed, artificial emotion. She began her performance by telling the crowd that today was not just about Madison's union, but about the incredible bond of the Harrison family. She called me her hero, her eldest daughter, Captain Olivia Harrison, and announced to the entire room that I had decided to provide the ultimate wedding gift for my sister, the deed to the $2 million penthouse at 150 Seaport. The room erupted into a wave of polite, rhythmic applause, a sound that felt like the closing of a trap. I was being shoved onto the stage by the sheer force of public expectation, a victim of what I now recognized as performative kindness designed to break my will through peer pressure. I began the walk toward the stage, each step feeling as heavy as if I were marching through deep mud in full combat gear. The blinding spotlight made it impossible to see the faces of the guests, leaving me staring into a black void of judgment. As I reached the platform, Victoria draped an arm around my shoulder, her grip like a steel vise disguised by silk. She pulled me close, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the cold sweat on my skin. And she leaned in to whisper a command directly into my ear. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was a razor-sharp snarl as she told me to smile and sign the documents immediately. She warned me not to force her hand or embarrass her further in front of the elite of Boston. On the small mahogany table beside us sat a thick leather folder and a gold-tipped Mont Blanc pen, with the family's private lawyer standing by like an expectant vulture. This was not a celebration of a sisterly bond. It was an organized robbery conducted in front of a live audience, hidden behind a curtain of white roses and expensive candlelight. The microphone was cold and heavy when Victoria pressed it into my hand, her eyes daring me to defy the narrative she had created. I stood there for a moment, the silence in the room becoming so absolute that I could hear the hum of the electronics in the walls. I looked at my mother, then turned my gaze to the darkened ballroom, refusing to let the light blind me any longer. When I spoke, my voice did not shake. It carried the authority of a commanding officer addressing a battalion. I told the room, and I told my mother, that there had been a profound misunderstanding. I stated clearly that the penthouse at 150 Seaport was a legacy left to me by my grandmother, Eleanor, to ensure my own independence and security. I announced to every person in that room that the property was not a gift, and that the demand for its transfer was being officially and permanently refused. The shock of my words seemed to ripple through the air, shattering the carefully curated atmosphere of the evening like a hammer through fine crystal. The silence that followed was suffocating, a vacuum of disbelief that lasted only seconds before the mask of the prestigious Victoria Harrison finally began to crack and fall away. She snatched the microphone back from my hand, her face contorting into a mask of raw, ugly fury that no amount of makeup could hide. In her desperation to regain control, she forgot that the microphone was still live. Her voice amplified and distorted as it echoed through the ballroom speakers. She shrieked, asking me if I had lost my mind and if I was truly intent on humiliating her after everything she had done for me. She called me an ungrateful child, a failure who was trying to destroy her family out of spite, and she demanded that I sign the papers right then and there. The elegance was gone, replaced by the desperate screeching tone of a cornered manipulator whose most precious commodity, her reputation, was melting away under the heat of the truth. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of family expectations forcing you into a corner where your only choice was to disappear or fight? To be publicly humiliated by the very people who should be your shield is a pain that leaves a scar on the soul. If you have ever stood your ground against a manipulator or survived the suffocating pressure of a family that demanded your silence, please hit the like button and share your experience in the comments by writing the word brave. I need to know that there are others who have found their voice when the world tried to take it away. As Victoria continued her tirade, the guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. the illusion of the perfect Harrison family dissolving before their very eyes. I didn't wait for her to finish or for the security guards to move in. I turned my back on the stage, on the lawyer, and on the woman who had spent my entire life trying to mold me into a silent accessory for her own ambition. I walked off that platform with my head held high, leaving the echoes of her anger to fill the void I left behind. I knew the real battle was only beginning, but for the first time, I wasn't fighting for their approval. I was fighting for my own existence, and the first shot of the counteroffensive had just been fired in the middle of their grandest stage. The clock on the ballroom wall read 7:35 in the evening on March 15, 2024, when the last shred of high society decorum evaporated into the humid, lily-scented air. Victoria had reached her breaking point. She lunged forward, her fingers digging like talons into the sleeve of my midnight navy gown, her face mere inches from mine. Her voice was no longer the melodic, controlled instrument of a Boston matriarch. It was a jagged, desperate rasp that cut through the silence of the 127 guests. She spat out the words, asking me who I thought I was, calling me nothing more than a stiff, ungrateful little grunt who didn't deserve the Harrison name. I looked down at her, my posture as rigid as a flagpole in a gale, and I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. I asked her if she truly cared about the Harrison name, or if she was simply mourning the loss of the $2 million she had already spent in her head. I asked if she had ever once wondered if I was alive or dead on the battlefield, or if she was just worried I would die before I could sign my inheritance over to her golden child. The truth hit her with more force than any physical blow could have, and in her blind, white-hot fury, she reacted with the only weapon she had left. Her hand came up in a blurred arc, fueled by years of resentment and the sudden, terrifying realization that she had lost her grip on me. Crack! The sound was dry and explosive, echoing through the cavernous ballroom like a gunshot during a ceasefire. It was the sound of a legacy shattering. The impact was so violent that my head was whipped to the side, and I felt the sharp tug of my pearl earring being torn from my lobe. It skittered across the polished hardwood floor, a tiny white sphere rolling into the shadows. A hot, metallic tang filled my mouth as a thin line of blood began to seep from the corner of my lip. The room erupted into a collective gasp of horror, the kind of sound a crowd makes when they witness a fatal accident. Tyler and Madison stood frozen, their mouths agape like statues of marble. My father, Richard, did the most characteristic thing he could. He simply turned his head away, staring at a floral arrangement as if he could erase the violence by refusing to witness it. In that moment, time seemed to slow to a crawl, the world narrowing down to the throb of my pulse in my cheek. I felt the primitive reptilian urge to strike back, a decade of combat training screaming in my muscles to neutralize the threat in front of me. My right hand clenched into a fist, the knuckles turning white, and for 2 seconds, Victoria was closer to death than she had ever been. But then, the core of my identity, the discipline that had been hammered into me by the United States Air Force, took control. I remembered that I was a commissioned officer, a leader of airmen, and a protector of the very people who were currently watching me bleed. I am a soldier, and a soldier does not strike a defenseless civilian, even when that civilian is the woman who gave her life. I slowly unfurled my fist, my fingers trembling not with fear, but with the immense effort of restraint. I stood perfectly straight, adjusting the collar of my gown with slow, deliberate movements that felt like a ceremony of dignity. I leaned down, picked up my pearl earring from the floor, and wiped the blood from my lip with the back of my hand, never once taking my eyes off the woman who had just tried to break me. The stillness I projected was more terrifying to Victoria than any scream or counterattack could have been. She stood there, gasping for air, her hand still raised and shaking from the impact of the blow. The fire in her eyes had been replaced by a flickering, uncertain fear as she looked at the blood on my face and the utter lack of emotion in my gaze. I leaned in, my voice a whisper of cold steel that carried further than her screams ever could. I told her that this was the very last time she would ever lay a hand on an officer of the Air Force. I told her she had just made the single greatest mistake of her life, one that no amount of Harrison money or influence could ever fix. I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and began the long march toward the grand exit, my footsteps echoing with the rhythmic precision of a military parade. As the heavy oak doors swung open, I pulled my phone from my clutch and pressed the speed dial for Marcus Webb. My voice was flat and decisive as I gave the order. Attorney Webb, execute Plan B, immediately. The clock on the wall of the Fairmont Copley Plaza ticked toward 8:45 in the evening on March 15, 2024. 1 hour had passed since the sound of my mother's hand hitting my face had shattered the last illusion of our family's prestige. The ballroom was a sea of uncomfortable whispers and averted eyes. Victoria was still on the stage, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as she tried to fix her hair and regain some semblance of the matriarchal power she had just forfeited. She was a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous, looking for any way to rewrite the narrative of her own violence. But the air in the room suddenly shifted. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall didn't just open, they were thrown wide with an authority that silenced every guest in an instant. It wasn't a waiter or a late guest who entered. It was Eleanor Harrison. My grandmother, the woman my mother had told everyone was slipping into the fog of dementia, walked into the room with a strength that defied her 82 years. She held an ebony cane that struck the floor with a rhythmic, grounded thud, her eyes sharp and clear like cold diamonds. Beside her walked Marcus Webb, the most formidable litigation attorney in Boston, and 2 uniformed officers from the Boston Police Department. The sight of her was like a seismic shift in the room's foundation. Victoria went deathly pale, her mouth hanging open as she gripped the podium for support. Eleanor didn't look at the crowd or the cameras. She walked straight to where I was standing near the exit, my cheeks swollen and dark, a small smear of dried blood still at the corner of my mouth. She reached up with a trembling but gentle hand, touching my injury with a tenderness I hadn't felt from a family member in years. She looked into my eyes, her own burning with a fierce, protective fire, and asked for a damage report. I stood at attention, my voice steady as I told her it was just a scratch and that the target had fully revealed herself. Eleanor turned toward the stage, facing her daughter and the elite crowd that had spent the night whispering about my supposed instability. She struck her cane against the floor once, a sound that echoed like a gavel in a courtroom, demanding total silence. Her voice was thin but carried a weight of absolute truth that made Victoria's previous screams seem like the tantrums of a child. Eleanor announced to the room that she was completely lucid and had never, at any point, authorized the sale of her home to fund her daughter's vanity. She told Victoria and everyone listening that she had gone too far. When Victoria tried to stammer out a defense, claiming she did everything for the sake of the family, Eleanor cut her off with a voice as sharp as a scalpel. She told her that she didn't do it for family. She did it for greed. She told her she had sold out the person who trusted her most and insulted the only grandchild who actually deserved the Harrison name. The moment of absolute reckoning arrived when Marcus Webb gave a quiet signal to the technical crew in the back. The massive LED screen behind the stage, which had been looping romantic, filtered photos of Madison and Tyler, suddenly went black. It flickered back to life, displaying a high-resolution scan of a legal contract for a property in Cape Cod. Beside it, the signature of Eleanor Harrison was magnified to 10 times its original size, and next to that was a forensic report marked with a bright red seal. The words on the screen were unmistakable. Forgery detected, 98.7% certainty. The entire ballroom erupted in a collective gasp of genuine shock. Marcus took a microphone and spoke with a calm legal precision that felt like a death sentence for Victoria's social life. He informed the room that they had irrefutable evidence that Victoria Harrison had forged her mother's signature while she was in a coma to embezzle $875,000. He stated that the files had already been delivered to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. The 2 police officers didn't hesitate. They climbed the stairs to the stage as Victoria backed away in terror, her heels catching on the hem of her expensive gown. She stumbled into the towering pyramid of champagne glasses, sending them crashing to the floor in a symphony of breaking crystal and wasted wine. She shrieked that it was all a misunderstanding, that she was the mother and she had rights, but the law remained indifferent to her frantic justifications. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of the handcuffs was the only sound in the room as they locked around her wrists, right over her diamond-encrusted bracelets. Eleanor watched her daughter being led away in silence, her face showing a deep, agonizing disappointment that was far more powerful than anger. She told Victoria that she was no longer her daughter, but ashamed to the name they both carried. The wedding of the century had officially become a crime scene, and as the guests began to turn their backs on the woman they had spent the evening flattering, I realized that justice doesn't always need a battlefield. Sometimes it just needs the truth and a witness who refuses to be silenced. The echoes of the sirens were still fading into the humid Boston night when the secondary players in Victoria's grand drama began to scavenge for whatever remained of their comfortable lives. Inside the lobby of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive flowers and the bitter tang of a social collapse. Tyler Caldwell, the man who was supposed to be the prize of the season, did not look like a grieving son-in-law or a supportive husband. He was drenched in a cold sweat, his expensive silk tie loosened as he chased after attorney Marcus Webb near the grand staircase. His voice was frantic, lacking any shred of the legal composure he usually boasted about, as he demanded to know if the criminal charges against Victoria would impact Madison's trust fund. He wasn't asking about his wife's emotional state or the woman who had just been led away in handcuffs. He was worried about the $2 million penthouse and whether the marriage contract he had just signed still guaranteed him access to the Harrison fortune. It was a raw display of hypergamy and cold-blooded opportunism that left a nauseating taste in the air. Grandma Eleanor turned her head slowly, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of seeing through men exactly like him. She informed him with a whisper of pure aristocratic contempt that he had chosen the wrong side of history. She told him that Madison had been removed from her latest will entirely, meaning the gold-digger groom had tied himself to a woman with exactly 0 cents to her name. Tyler stood there, the realization of his total financial defeat turning his face into a pale, hollow mask of regret. A few yards away, the golden girl of the Harrison family was a broken heap of white lace on the marble floor. Madison sat with her Vera Wang gown spreading out like a stained cloud, her makeup ruined by tears of pure, self-centered shock. She wailed my name, her voice echoing off the high ceilings as she accused me of being a monster and single-handedly destroying the most important day of her life. She looked at me with the same entitled expectation she had used her entire life, waiting for me to step in and fix the disaster. But the woman who used to shield her from the consequences of her own choices was gone. I looked down at my sister and felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. I told her that I had not destroyed her wedding. Her own greed and the criminal arrogance of our mother had done that for her. I reminded her that she was 28 years old and that the time for playing the helpless victim had officially expired. I told her to get up, wipe her face, and start the long process of cleaning up her own wreckage because I was no longer her nanny or her backup plan. It was the final boundary, a surgical strike that severed the umbilical cord of emotional labor I had been forced to provide for 3 decades. The most painful confrontation, however, came from the man who had been a ghost in his own home for as long as I could remember. My father, Richard, approached me with the hesitant, fawning steps of a man who realized the power dynamic had shifted, and he was on the losing end of the battlefield. He tried to play the role of the compassionate mediator, asking me to use my influence with Eleanor to show mercy toward Victoria. He argued that she was too old for a prison sentence, and that, regardless of her crimes, we were still a family. I looked at the man who had stood by in cowardly silence while I was slapped, while I was erased, and while I was treated like a servant in my own heritage. I asked him where his sense of family was at 1935 that evening when his wife's hand struck my face. I asked him where he was when I was being pushed out of my own life while he stared at the floor. I told him that his silence throughout the years was his true legacy, and that, as of that moment, I no longer recognized him as my father. The finality of my words seemed to physically shrink him. I turned my back on the man who had abandoned me long before the first sirens arrived, cutting the last tether to a past built on the lies of a prestigious family. As I helped Grandma Eleanor toward the exit, the lobby was flooded with the rhythmic, aggressive flashes of the paparazzi. The downfall of the Harrisons was the story of the year, a spectacular collapse of old money and new crimes. I did not hide my face or lower my head as we moved through the crowd. I walked with the measured, rhythmic pace of an officer who had successfully completed a difficult mission. Before we reached the waiting black sedan, a woman named Jennifer Thompson, a high-ranking partner at a prominent security and risk management firm, intercepted us. She handed me her card and told me she had witnessed the way I maintained tactical control while the entire social structure of the ballroom disintegrated. She said her firm was looking for a leader with my specific kind of steel to spearhead their new veteran-led security initiative. It was more than a job offer. It was a confirmation of the value I had forged in the Air Force, a value that my family had spent years trying to convince me didn't exist. As the car door closed and we drove away from the lights of the Fairmont, I felt the first true breath of air in my lungs in years. The battlefield was cleared, the enemies were neutralized, and for the first time in my life, I was retreating into a future of my own design. The balcony of Penthouse 150 in the Seaport District caught the first golden light of a June morning in 2024. I sat there with a cup of black coffee, watching the sailboats glide across the Boston Harbor, their white sails catching the wind like the wings of a bird finally released from a cage. There were no more screams of entitlement, no more suffocating judgments, and no more scripts I had to follow to survive. The air was salt-tinged and fresh, carrying the promise of a summer that belonged entirely to me. Inside the living room, Grandma Eleanor sat in her favorite velvet armchair, turning the pages of a book with a peaceful, contented smile on her face. This home, which my mother had tried so hard to steal, was now a sanctuary filled with light and the quiet hum of a life being rebuilt on a foundation of absolute truth. I reached up and touched my cheek, the place where that stinging blow had landed months ago. The physical pain was a ghost of the past, and even the emotional ache had faded into a dull, distant memory. I realized then that I had won the war, not by using my fists or my rank to strike back, but by standing firm in my integrity until the darkness had no choice but to retreat. On the mahogany side table lay the morning edition of the paper, its headlines no longer shouting about the prestigious Harrison family, but detailing the quiet, inevitable collapse of a fraudulent empire. The news reported that the former matriarch of Beacon Hill had been sentenced to 3 years of probation and extensive community service for her financial crimes, her reputation in the city permanently tarnished. The Harrison name, which Victoria had valued above all else, was now synonymous with a cautionary tale of greed and the hollow pursuit of status. Madison and Tyler had divorced after only 2 months, their union dissolving the moment they realized there was no trust fund left to scavenge and no social ladder left for them to climb. My father, Richard, now lived alone in a cramped, unremarkable apartment, his occasional calls for financial help going unanswered as I maintained the silence he had once used against me. I had learned the hardest lesson of all, that forgiveness does not require me to open the door to my house or my heart for people who only want to set it on fire again. I had drawn a line in the sand with the tactical precision of a military operation, and for the first time in my life, that boundary was being respected. My phone buzzed on the table, a gentle vibration that signaled a life moving forward with purpose. It was a message from Jennifer Thompson, welcoming me officially to her firm as a senior security consultant. It was a role where my military experience and my ability to navigate high-stress environments were viewed as strategic assets rather than social liabilities. For years, I had been told that my career was low-class, but here, among people who built their own success, I found a level of respect I had never known at the dinner tables of Beacon Hill. And then, there was a message from Ben, the structural engineer I'd met at the local library weeks ago while researching historical architecture. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk by the water tonight, promising he knew a place that served the best clam chowder in the city. I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth, a genuine, unforced expression of joy that reached my eyes. I was no longer the lonely soldier or the family scapegoat. I was a woman who was respected for her intellect and loved for her character, surrounded by a chosen family that saw me as I truly was. I stood up and straightened my light jacket, looking out over the water one last time before starting my day. The path to this peace had been paved with betrayal and isolation, but every scar was a testament to a strength I didn't know I possessed. I imagine speaking to everyone who had ever felt small, or broken, or silenced by the very people who were supposed to be their shield. I am Olivia Harrison. I have been rejected by my mother, used by my sister, and abandoned by my father in my moment of greatest need. But I did not break. I took every bit of that pain and forged it into a sense of discipline and self-love that no one can ever take away from me. If you are listening to this from the middle of your own shadow, I need you to remember that you are the commanding officer of your own soul. Do not wait for a rescue party that might never arrive, and do not expect the people who hurt you to provide the apology you deserve. Give yourself the order to advance, stand your ground, and realize that you have the power to create your own dawn. I raised my hand in a final sharp salute to the horizon, my eyes fixed on the rising light. The mission was complete. Olivia Harrison's journey serves as a powerful testament to the necessity of self-defined honor. The story illustrates that while family is an inherent part of one's background, it does not hold the ultimate authority to dictate an individual's destiny or strip away personal dignity. Resilience is not merely about surviving hardship, it is the active transformation of pain into a disciplined resolve. True victory lies in the courage to establish firm boundaries against toxicity, even when those boundaries come at a high emotional cost. It serves as a reminder that honor is an internal fortress, built through integrity and sustained by the strength to stand firm when the world demands submission. A reflection on the path to healing often reveals hidden strengths, much like the ones discovered throughout this narrative. Standing firm against manipulation from those closest to us is a profound act of bravery that deserves recognition. Support for this channel can be shown by hitting the like button and subscribing to ensure more stories of resilience and justice reach those who need them. Every experience shared in the comments helps build a stronger community of survivors. Readers are encouraged to share their thoughts below by typing the word brave and describing a time they had to prioritize their own peace over a toxic dynamic